And that's what rock and roll is all about, that edge, the peak, the thing. And this song's about rock.
For decades, Neil Young has been one of rock's most mysterious figures, a man whose music speaks volumes, yet whose personal opinions have remained cloaked in quiet defiance. From his poetic lyrics to his unpredictable turns between acoustic tenderness and roaring distortion, Neil has built a career defined by one simple rule: honesty. He's never followed trends, never bowed to the industry, and never cared what others thought. But now, at 79, the rock legend has done something fans never expected. He's finally opened up about the albums that shaped his life. These aren't just random favorites. Each record he named reveals a different chapter of his soul. From the sounds that sparked his rebellion to the songs that guided him through heartbreak, protest, and self-discovery. In a world obsessed with lists and rankings, Neil's choices aren't about popularity or chart success. They're about feeling, about music that told the truth when few others dared. After a lifetime of inspiring generations of artists and refusing to compromise, Neil Young's list of his 10 favorite rock albums isn't just a collection of songs. It's a roadmap of his heart. Some of the names might surprise you, some you'll expect, but every one of them tells you who Neil really is. And once you hear his reasons, you'll never listen to these albums the same way again. Neil Young's story is one written in distortion, defiance, and pure emotion. Born in Toronto, Canada in 1945, Young's musical journey began long before fame found him. As a restless teenager, he fell in love with the rawness of early rock and roll. Not the polished perfection of pop hits, but the unrefined honesty of guitar-driven rebellion. When he moved to Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, it didn't take long for the world to notice. As part of Buffalo Springfield, Neil's songwriting stood out. Poetic, unpredictable, and unafraid to confront the truth. And when he went solo, his legend began to truly take shape. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Neil had already become a voice for a generation torn between peace and chaos. Albums like After the Gold Rush and Harvest weren't just records, they were emotional lifelines. His fragile voice, haunting melodies, and willingness to confront loss, love, and political disillusionment made him one of the few artists whose work actually felt alive. Each song was a snapshot of who he was in that moment, flawed, real, and human. But Neil's path was never smooth. Throughout his career, he clashed with record labels, refused commercial compromises, and famously said, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." He changed musical directions constantly, from folk to country, from grunge to electronic experiments, leaving critics confused, but loyal fans inspired. His unpredictability became his trademark. While others chased hits, Neil chased meaning. And yet, behind that fierce independence was a man shaped by music just as deeply as he shaped it. Those who know Neil well describe him as a listener before anything else. Someone who absorbs sounds, textures, and emotions until they become part of his identity. For him, music isn't entertainment. It's truth-telling. The artists he admired were the ones who meant every word they sang, who lived their lyrics, and who didn't hide behind fame. Over the decades, as Neil's own songs became anthems for authenticity, fans wondered which records had molded his perspective. What did he listen to when he wasn't creating his own masterpieces? Which sounds lit the fire that made Neil Young Neil Young? For years he avoided the question, brushing it off in interviews with his usual modesty and humor. But as time passed, he began reflecting more on legacy, not just his own, but the legacy of the music that built him. Now, at 79, his decision to finally share his 10 favorite rock albums feels almost poetic. These records aren't just favorites, they're the foundation of his artistry, the silent mentors that taught him what music could be. Each one represents a part of his evolution: the folk idealist, the angry rocker, the environmental activist, and the nostalgic dreamer. And when Neil talks about them, you can hear the same passion in his voice that has carried through every note he's ever sung. For Neil, this list isn't about nostalgia. It's about gratitude, to the sounds that gave him courage, to the artists who showed him honesty mattered more than fame, and to the songs that still echo in his soul decades later. It's a glimpse into the heart of a man who spent his entire life searching for truth, and found it in the music of others. For Neil Young, Music has never been about perfection. It's about truth. He's often said that a song doesn't need to be technically flawless to move people. What matters is whether it means something. This belief became the core of his musical philosophy, and it explains why his list of favorite rock albums isn't filled with chart toppers or overly produced records. Instead, it's a reflection of the same values that shaped his career: honesty, emotion, and rebellion against conformity. Neil has always admired artists who weren't afraid to sound imperfect, to leave the rough edges in, and to let emotion lead the way. When something's too polished, he once said, it loses its soul. To him, the greatest records were made by musicians who didn't follow formulas. They followed their instincts. That's why his influences stretch across a wide emotional spectrum, from aching vulnerability to thunderous rage. Throughout his career, Neil's songs often mirrored the same qualities he admired in others. When you listen to Down by the River or Old Man, you hear the same raw sincerity that drew him to the artists he considers timeless. His music was never built to impress critics or fit radio formats. Instead, it captured what it felt like to live, to love, lose, and question the world around you. That sense of searching, of constant evolution, is exactly what ties him to the music he holds closest. In interviews, Neil has admitted that he's often more inspired by spirit than by sound. Some albums, he says, feel alive, like they're breathing. That quality is what makes a record endure for decades. To him, a great rock album doesn't just play songs. It builds an atmosphere. It can transport you, break your heart, or make you see life differently, even after a single listen. Another part of Neil's philosophy is his deep respect for authenticity, not only in lyrics but in the way music is made. He's famously critical of modern digital production, arguing that it strips away the warmth and texture of real sound. This belief led him to launch projects like Pono Music, his high-resolution audio service, aimed at bringing listeners closer to the raw, unfiltered experience of analog sound. For Neil, great albums are living, breathing things, full of imperfections, yet rich with humanity. That perspective has also influenced his view of other artists. He's not drawn to those who chase fame, but to those who stay true to themselves, even when it's hard. The albums that shaped him, the ones that still echo in his mind today, all share that same defiant authenticity. They're albums made by people who took risks, who refused to compromise, and who believed in their art above all else. When Neil talks about his favorite records, you can hear a deep respect, almost reverence, in his tone. He doesn't just love the music, he honors it. He sees these albums as milestones in the story of rock itself, the points where truth broke through the noise. Each one, in its own way, represents the courage to be vulnerable and the conviction to stand apart. At 79, Neil Young's philosophy on music remains unchanged. He's still chasing that raw spark, that human pulse that lives inside every great record. And as he prepares to reveal the 10 albums that defined his life, one thing is certain: they won't be chosen for fame or prestige. They'll be chosen for something far rarer: the ability to speak directly to the soul. After years of silence on the subject, Neil Young finally broke his quiet tradition during a rare sit-down interview, where he opened up about the albums that shaped his musical DNA. With a half smile and that familiar twinkle in his eye, Neil leaned back and said, "These are the records that never left me." What followed wasn't just a list, it was a roadmap of his heart, a journey through decades of sound, rebellion, and emotion. The first album Neil mentioned was Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited. To him, it was the perfect example of what songwriting could be: fearless, poetic, and unapologetically human. "When I first heard it," Neil recalled, "I knew music could be something more than entertainment. It could be truth." Dylan's raw delivery and lyrical honesty would later become guiding principles in Neil's own work. Next came the Beatles' Rubber Soul. Neil said this album changed how he viewed the boundaries of rock. Its blend of melody, emotion, and experimentation inspired him to dig deeper into storytelling and sound. "They made it okay to evolve," he said. "They taught me that growth is part of art. He also cited the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Saint as one of his personal favorites, calling it a beautiful mess. The grit, the imperfections, the soulful chaos, all of it resonated with Neil's own approach to music. It wasn't about getting it right, he said. It was about feeling it. Then came Jimi Hendrix's Are You Experienced?, which Neil described as a revelation. The guitar work, the emotion, the soundscape. It opened doors to what was possible with 6 strings and electricity. Hendrix wasn't just playing the guitar, Neil said. He was talking through it. Neil also mentioned the band's Music from Big Pink. That record, he explained, captured the spirit of community and musicianship that defined the late 60s. They played for each other, not for fame, he said softly. That's how music should be made. Moving forward, Neil's list took a turn toward albums that carried emotional gravity. He spoke highly of Bruce Springsteen's Darkness on the Edge of Town, calling it the sound of a man fighting for his soul. For Neil, the honesty and desperation in Springsteen's voice reminded him of his own struggles between art and fame. He also included The Who's Who's Next, praising its power and vision. Pete Townshend wrote like his life depended on it, Neil said. That's how you're supposed to write. One of the more surprising inclusions was Patti Smith's Horses. Neil said he admired her courage to speak her truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. She had guts, he said. That's what rock and roll is supposed to be about. He went on to name Pearl. Jam's 10, explaining that the band reminded him of what he called the fire that keeps rock alive. He's long admired their authenticity, so much so that he collaborated with them in the 90s. They meant every note, Neil said, and that's rare. Finally, he mentioned Crazy Horse's Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, the album that began his lifelong collaboration with the band that helped define his signature sound. It's not about ego, Neil said of the record. It's about chemistry, the kind that can't be faked. When the list was done, Neil chuckled and said, "Ask me tomorrow, and it might be different." But behind that modesty was something deeper, a reflection of a life spent chasing the heart of music. His choices weren't about nostalgia or influence, they were about truth. And through these 10 albums, Neil Young finally revealed the sounds that made him who he is, restless, honest, and forever searching. When Neil Young's list of favorite rock albums was finally revealed, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Fans, critics, and fellow musicians rushed to dissect every choice, not because they were controversial, but because they were so deeply Neil. Each title, each era reflected not just the story of rock music, but the story of Neil's own life within it. It wasn't a flashy list meant to impress. It was honest, rugged, and beautifully unpredictable, just like the man himself. For lifelong fans, the inclusion of artists like Dylan, Hendrix, and the band felt perfectly in character. These were the voices that walked beside Neil through the birth of modern rock, kindred spirits who shared his obsession with truth and imperfection. Online forums filled with comments from listeners who said they could hear Neil's entire career echoing in those albums. One fan wrote, "You can tell this list came from someone who's lived music, not just listened to it." Critics, too, were struck by the sincerity of his choices. Many noted how his picks cut through the noise of commercialism and nostalgia, pointing instead toward timeless artistry. A reviewer from Rolling Stone wrote, "Neil Young's top 10 list is less a reflection of the past and more a reminder of what real music stands for: rebellion, authenticity, and emotion." Others admired how his selection spanned generations, connecting the golden age of rock to the sounds that still define it today. But what stood out most was how personal the list felt. Each album Neil named seemed to mirror a part of his own journey: the poetic defiance of Dylan, the experimental courage of Hendrix, the communal spirit of the band, the raw emotion of Springsteen. Every record was like a mirror, reflecting the phases of Neil's ever-changing musical soul. The choices showed that even after all these years, he's still that same curious, searching artist. Someone who believes music is a living thing, not a product to be sold. Younger musicians also reacted with admiration. calling the list a masterclass in musical integrity. Many said it inspired them to revisit the roots of rock, to dig deeper into why certain songs still feel alive decades later. Neil's list isn't about being cool, one modern rocker said. It's about remembering where all of this came from. Interestingly, Neil didn't rank his favorites, insisting that you can't put music on a ladder. That sentiment struck a chord with fans. It was a gentle reminder that art isn't a competition, it's connection. His humility in the face of such towering works revealed something rare in today's music world, a true reverence for the craft. In the weeks following the reveal, countless fans shared their own Neil-inspired playlists online, mixing tracks from his top 10 into their daily lives. It became more than just a list. It became a communal celebration of rock's history. For many, it also reignited appreciation for analog sound. Simple songwriting and emotional honesty, qualities Neil has defended his entire life. As one music critic put it, in a world obsessed with streaming numbers and viral hits, Neil Young just reminded us why rock still matters. And that's perhaps the greatest takeaway from his revelation. It wasn't just about his favorite albums. It was about the timeless bond between music and emotion, between artist and audience. Even at 79, Neil's passion burns just as brightly as it did in his youth. Through his words and his choices, he once again managed to do what he's always done best: bring the focus back to what's real. His list wasn't a goodbye. It was a love letter. A love letter to the records that shaped him, the artists who stood beside him, and the fans who've kept his music alive for more than half a century. Looking back, Neil Young's list of favorite rock albums wasn't just a random selection. It was a window into his musical soul. Each album reflected a chapter in his life, a moment where sound shaped memory and emotion molded artistry. These records weren't merely his favorites. They were the foundation upon which his entire career was built. When Neil praised the band's self-titled album, fans saw how much he admired raw storytelling. The way Robbie Robertson crafted lyrics about working-class struggle in rural America deeply resonated with Neil's own approach to songwriting. It's no surprise that the rustic simplicity of the band helped inspire Neil's Harvest. There was a time when he sought beauty in imperfection and truth in pain. His admiration for Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde wasn't about musical complexity but honesty. Young had always said Dylan made imperfection sound perfect, and that mantra defined Neil's work for decades. Dylan showed him that emotion, not polish, is what connects an artist to an audience. That belief would drive Young's fearless pursuit of authenticity, even when it alienated fans or critics. When asked why the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Saint made the list, Neil explained that it wasn't about fame, it was about attitude. The chaos and soul of that album mirrored his own restless spirit. "It's dirty, it's wild, it's real," he said once. "That's rock and roll to me." The same grit could be heard in Tonight's The Night and Rust Never Sleeps albums that weren't clean but carried the scars of truth. Neil's affection for the Beatles' Rubber Soul and Lead Zeppelin Ive revealed something softer, a deep love for melody and exploration. While Neil was known for his rugged voice and heavy guitar tone, he secretly admired how those records blended tenderness and power. To him, that balance was the heart of great music, where emotion meets rebellion. But perhaps the most telling choice was Pearl Jam's 10. Many were surprised he picked something from the 1990s. But Neil saw in Pearl Jam the same fire that fueled him in the 60s. Their energy reminded him that rock music was alive, evolving, and unafraid to confront the world's pain. In truth, Neil Young's favorite albums told his story better than any biography could. They charted his evolution, from a young man seeking meaning in sound to a legend who helped define rock's soul. Even at 79, his love for raw, heartfelt music remained unshaken. For Neil, it was never about trends or fame. It was always about the song, the heartbeat of truth that echoes long after the music fades. And in naming his favorite albums, Neil didn't just share his taste. He shared the roadmap to his very essence.